let's do that. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes is at the top of the list because why wouldn't you start Patrick Mahomes every week? Aaron Rodgers sort of in the same tier there. Ryan Tannehill, kind of an interesting one this week. He's facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who've struggled defensively. He's also the QB7 on the season, very quietly sitting there in the top 10. Similarly, Deshaun Watson, he keeps losing wide receivers in Houston, but he keeps on producing. And even against this Bears defense, I have no fear about starting Deshaun Watson. And then finally in that top tier, Russell Wilson. I know he hasn't been cooking a whole lot lately, but I do think this is a big bounce back week for him against the Jets.
Yeah, we're all in agreement on all of those guys. You can't go away from them. But after those elite options, we get to the second tier of quarterbacks for Week 14, and they don't quite make that list of Tier 1. But Rank, let's start off with some guys we do endorse as starters this week.
Well, I really like Lamar Jackson, and this might be the player that I'm getting asked about the most on Twitter. I love the match. I thought he was great against the Cowboys. I know he missed some throws, and it's easy to sit there in those island games and pick apart everything that he does. But he was really good. He had over 20 fantasy points the second time he's done that in his last 3 games. The Browns have allowed the 7th most yards per game to quarterbacks this season, so I like him. Kyler Murray's a little bit more difficult because he's had fewer than 17 fantasy points in consecutive games, so I'm a little concerned with that. The Giants are playing a lot better. Tom Brady, though, I have more confidence in. Great matchup this week against the Vikings, who've allowed the 8th most yards per games to quarterbacks.
Yeah, you talked about Kyler Murray, and he has slipped to this second tier of quarterbacks. I would say about a month ago, he was a lock for kind of a must start, but part of it is he's just not running the football as much as he had earlier in the season. In fact, his last 3 games, a combined 61 rushing yards out of Kyler. And as you mentioned, that Giants defense is tougher than I think a lot of people want to remember at first blush. So I would start him, but I would certainly be concerned about his ability to produce in a big playoff week for you.
And you heard Rank talking about Tom Brady. I also like Tom Brady this week. He's been playing well as of late, scoring over 21 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. He has multiple passing touchdowns in all 3 of those. And like Rank said, it's just a favorable matchup. They have allowed the 8th most passing yards per game to quarterbacks and the 5th most touchdown passes. So I think Tom Brady has had some success in his playoff career. So why not the fantasy playoffs for Touchdown Tom?
Yeah, I feel for the folks, Florio, that had to drop Tom Brady on the bye to get into the playoffs. Now they're scrambling. Hey, if you need one, I got Kirk Cousins here in Tier 2 because you're starting Justin Jefferson, right? You're starting Adam Thielen, right? Well, Kirk has scored 20-plus points in 3 straight games. Tough to imagine the Bucs grinding it out in a slog. And remember how good the Bucs defense used to be? They've seen top 12 production from the other quarterback in 5 of their last 6 games. Kirk wraps us up in Tier 2 here. Mr. Florio, back to you. If none of our first or second tiers are available, who do you get?
I'm going with Big Ben here just because he's been pretty safe, and if I'm diving a little bit deeper in the fantasy playoffs, I want a quarterback that comes with a safe floor, and that's what Big Ben comes with. He has thrown multiple passing touchdowns in 10 of 12 games this year. He has gone over 300 yards in 3 of his last 5 and at least 260 in all of those games. And while the Bills defense has been playing a little bit better, they still allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So I would just play it safe here and go with Big Ben.
Ben's a solid option. Let's get his fellow quarterback classmate in Phillip Rivers facing the defense that had trouble getting off the field last week against the Jets. He's gotten 2 touchdowns each of his last 3 games, and that's with him getting subbed out at the goal line for vaunted athlete Jacoby Brissett. So, hey, maybe Phillip Rivers isn't that bad of a choice.
No, he's a really good choice, Patrick. And I'm also looking at Matt Ryan this week against the LA Chargers, his former team, Phillip Rivers' former team, I should say. Ryan has had at least 270 passing yards in 5 out of his last 7 games. The Chargers have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season, the 5th most passing touchdowns. I expect this to be a really high-scoring game here in Inglewood. So I would actually feel more comfortable with Matt Ryan over Kirk Cousins. No disrespect to you, though.
That sounded like a lot of disrespect. So I'm going to just pivot to Matthew Stafford. And the matchup necessarily isn't great against the Packers, but I do see this as being kind of a game script / volume issue for Stafford in this one. The Lions defensively are going to give up points. They're going to give up yards. So it's going to be incumbent on Stafford to throw the football to try and keep this offense in the game. It sort of stinks that he's not going to have Kenny Golladay for yet another week. But I think just having to throw the ball a ton of times is going to give him at least a halfway safe floor this week.
Which running backs can we trust in Week 14? Marcus, who are you starting in your quest to bring home that ring?
Aaron Jones is near the top of the list, especially this week against the Lions. It was Jones who had a huge game against Detroit in Week 2. In fact, had a season-high 45.6 fantasy points. He's had double-digit fantasy points in every game he's played this year. Now he gets his second shot at the league's 28th ranked run defense, the defense that's given up the most fantasy points per game to the running back position. He is seems like a sure thing to help you get to the next round.
Yeah, I really like Aaron Jones this week. He's my RB2, but my RB1 is going to be Derrick Henry going up against my friends down in Duval County, who've allowed the third most scrimmage yards to running backs this season, the fourth most fantasy points per game. And I understand that last week, Derrick Henry might not have given you the performance that you wanted out of him, but you know what? You were just resting up for the playoffs because his playoff schedule is amazing, kicking off with this game. So Derrick Henry is on the cusp of bringing home that ring.
Yeah, I like both of those picks a lot as potential league winners. Another back that I'm really excited for right now is David Montgomery. He has scored over 25 fantasy points in 2 straight games, those being against the Lions and Packers. So he has shown us that he can exploit a good matchup, which is exactly what he has this week against the Houston Texans, who allowed the most yards and the second most fantasy points per game to running backs. And it's not just this week. He is the second best fantasy playoff schedule amongst running backs. So get used to starting this guy.
Yeah, very friendly schedule for Montgomery. We like all those backs. Who do we not trust this week, Marcus?
I'm going to have to go with Miles Sanders, which hurts because I was a big fan of him coming into the season, thought maybe the breakout year was coming, but it just has not materialized that way. His snaps have decreased over the last 4 weeks. He's had 10 or fewer touches in back-to-back games. In fact, Jordan Howard had 11 carries, or had a handful of carries, I should say, last week. So he's sort of losing out to Howard. He's losing out to Boston Scott. And I think this week especially, game script could be a factor against the Saints. If New Orleans jumps out to a big lead, that could pretty much eliminate Miles Sanders from the game plan altogether.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Chiefs running backs, just the whole stable, going up against the Miami Dolphins, who've allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points to running backs this season. But it just seems like there's too many good players here in this Chiefs backfield, and we don't know who to trust, even though Clyde Edwards-Helaire is expected to be back. Le'Veon Bell, it's kind of like the NWO Wolfpack. You know, it's like a lot of good guys, but remember like Sting? Sting was in the NWO Wolfpack and never really did anything. That's Le'Veon Bell. It's like, oh, it's a superstar, but he's not. He's in the mid-card fighting, Kurt Hennig or whatever. I just don't like the situation this week. I'd rather go with one of the Chiefs receivers or Travis Kelce.
I guess then Todd Gurley would be like Hulk Hogan in the NWO, kind of past his prime, but I am really scared about Todd Gurley this week. He has scored fewer than 4 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Since week 8, he is averaging less than 40 yards per game, and he has just 1 game over 90 all year. Really, all you're getting out of him is touchdowns. The issue is the Chargers have only allowed 7 rushing touchdowns to running backs this year, and that's towards the bottom of the league. I would really get Gurley out of my lineup this week because if he doesn't score a touchdown, he could cost you your whole season.
What wideout do you think that Florio rated just too high?
Where to begin with this list? Well, let's start with Deebo Samuel, who I feel is just way too high on this list. What did something happen? Is Brandon Ayuk not playing? Did I miss this somehow? Because when I was watching the game last week, it seemed like they were really making a concerted effort to go to Brandon Ayuk. Plus, he's got a tough matchup this week. The Washington FT have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers this season. They've allowed the 3rd fewest touchdowns to receivers this year with just 9. So for me, I like Deebo. He's a good player. I just feel this is a little too high on your rankings.
I do get all of those concerns, but the reason why I'm high on Deebo is you see it on this tape here. He is just so explosive after the catch, and he has seen at least 9 targets in 2 straight games. And while Washington defense has played great over the last month, they've actually allowed the 5th most points to wide receivers. So I'm just hoping that with all the volume going his way, that he can break a long one out in this game. And I like his chances of doing so.
All right, what about Stefon Diggs, Rank? How do you feel Florio placed him in his wide receiver rankings?
Yeah, this is another one. I like the player. I like him a lot. I don't like the situation that he's walking into this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. They've allowed a top 10 wide receiver just once in their last 6 games, and in their most recent contest, they shut down Terry McLaurin. The receiver that I would trust in this instance is actually Cole Beasley, who's had 11 targets in 2 out of the last 3 games. That's the Bills receiver I would want to go with.
I do like Cole Beasley a lot, and I wish I had like an evil bunny or glasses or something to sell this point even better.
I know you did.
But I do like Stephon Diggs too. This is the lowest I've probably ranked him in weeks, but he has double-digit fantasy points in every game this season and at least 9 targets in 6 straight. So I find it hard that you have a wide receiver on your bench that can guarantee you that kind of production.
That's fair.
Right. Can we see the front of the bunny? Or is the bunny okay, or is it having some sort of digestion
Hold on,
problem? There we go. The bunny's good.
There it is. The bunny's good.
Okay. Is the bunny in a better position than Tyler Boyd is in Florio's receiver rankings?
Let me confer with my assistant. Yeah, we need Tyler Boyd to be higher up on this list because again, this feels too low. Obviously, last week he had that big reception, this 72-yard touchdown. You were excited. He scored you 15 fantasy points. You're like, this is going to be the greatest day of all time. Then obviously he gets ejected, but he's got such a great matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, who've allowed the 9th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. They've allowed 20-plus points to 8 wide receivers this year. That's tied for the 2nd most in the NFL. And I know Florio's going to be like, but I like T. Higgins, which is fine. I like T. Higgins as well. Let's just give a little respect to Tyler Boyd, please. Don't anger the bunny.
I'm going to try not to anger the bunny. The reason I'm scared on Boyd rank is with Brandon Allen this year, he's averaging less than 10 points. He had the 15 last week, but he had less than 5 the game before that. And that's really what is scaring me, is the fact that I could start this guy in a good matchup and he could go out and give me 4 or 5 fantasy points and eliminate me. So maybe I need to move him up a little bit to make you and the bunny happy, but I'm just scared that he can give us a big dud this game.
Bunny's still not happy.
Well, if you want a bunny labor-free look at Michael F. Florio's fantasy rankings for Week 14, just hop on over to NFL.com/fantasy. We've covered the quarterbacks, the running backs, the receivers. Marcus, let's get defensive.
Let's get defensive indeed, Patrick. So if you have one of those elite defenses like the Steelers or the Saints or the Ravens, then you can spend the next couple of minutes just smugly smiling at your television. But for the rest of us normies who have to stream defenses, here are 5 units that you might consider starting in Week 14. We will start at number 5, and maybe a surprise here for the Dallas Cowboys. I know we have been picking on the Cowboys defense all season long, but maybe we can pick back on the Bengals offense. Cincinnati's given up 16 sacks over the past 4 weeks. That's the 2nd most. They've also given the ball away 9 times in this one. So Cowboys could luck up on a few turnovers and score some fantasy points for you. Number 4, going to go with the Arizona Cardinals facing the New York Football Giants. Big Blue is giving up the 6th most fantasy points per game to defense and special teams unit, the 5th most sacks allowed, and Daniel Jones himself has been quite a turnover machine with 13 total giveaways in 2020. Number 3, maybe not a huge surprise here, but it is the Washington Football Team, who's been really one of the better defenses all season long in actual football. Now they get a chance to take aim at Nick Mullins and the 49ers. Mullins has 10 giveaways in 8 games. This Washington front is tied with the 4th most sacks in the National Football League. At number 2, we'll go with the Carolina Panthers. They get to take their shot at Drew Lock and the Broncos. Lock has been giving the ball away quite a bit so far this season. 12 interceptions in his last 7 games, 4 of those multiple INTs for Lock. The Panthers, who already have a pretty good secondary, could be looking to feast on the Broncos quarterback. At number 1, it is the Seattle Seahawks. Yes, we have been picking on the Jets pretty much all season long on both sides of the ball, and the Seahawks have been getting better. The Jets giving up the most fantasy points per game to defenses, and they have averaged fewer than 14 points scored per game. This feels like a chance for the Seahawks to pick up against a pretty bad offense.
Marcus, surprise us with a guy that could make a big impact this week.
I'm going to look at the New York Jets offense and say Ty Johnson. Now, the first thing to note here is keep an eye on the status of Frank Gore. There is certainly a chance that he could be activated from the concussion protocol and ready to go for this one. But if Gore cannot play, last week it was Johnson who stepped in place of the injured Frank Gore and played nearly 62% of the snaps, got a really heavy workload, had over 100 rushing yards, and now he gets to take aim at the Seahawks, who've given up the 5th most fantasy points per game to the running back position over the last 4 weeks. So it could be a nice RB2 find for you if he gets to play.
One of the receivers I'm going to be looking at is Jalen Reagor. He's going up against the New Orleans Saints. This is not the ideal matchup. And obviously, I'm hoping that the switch to Jalen Hurts is going to propel him. And that's what we're really looking for here. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you lost Julio Jones or one of your receivers isn't playing for whatever reason, I would take a chance with him. I think there is some upside with this one. Now, it's going to be a lot. Again, it's going to be difficult, but that's why these are called sleepers and not automatic starts. So I like the upside with Reagor, and if you need him, I say give him a shot.
Yeah, we got surprising sleepers for everybody, and the biggest surprise for me with Tim Patrick was that he was available in almost 90% of leagues, in fact, over 90% of leagues, despite the fact that he locked up double digits in 4 of his last 5 games. He's right in that kind of wide receiver 3 range if you're in a competitive league. And you need a late move, as Rank mentioned. You're losing Julio this week. You're worried about some other guys. Go out there and pick up Tim Patrick.
I like it, Patrick. And Dalton Schultz is a tight end that I like this week. He has scored at least 7 fantasy points in 5 straight games. The Bengals have allowed the 4th most points per game to tight ends. And Mike Gesicki just scored 25 points against him last week. So I think you can go ahead and start Dalton Schultz this week.
Shout out to Florida there, working through some throat trouble to get you Dalton Schultz, who's one of many more sleepers that you can find in Florio's weekly column today at NFL.com/fantasy. You go there and check it out. While you're at the site, check out his position rankings. We got them for you right here. Here are his top 10 tight ends for the week. But for those of us without one of the guys there between Kelsey and Henry or Schultz, we've gathered up some Twitter questions about this tight end position in deeper leagues. We start with this from Andres, who wants to know who you'd start between Jonnu Smith and Zach Ertz, Florio.
I would go with Jonnu Smith here. He has scored at least 9 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and he has 8 touchdowns this year, which is tied for the most amongst tight ends. And if you're starting a tight end and you could give me a touchdown or 9 fantasy points, I'm going to take it. And with Zach Ertz, the usage is just unknown there with Jalen Hurts, and I am happy that my throat is better because I sound like normal now.
Huh.
Yeah. In fact, an update on Hooper. We're going to find out his status coming up closer to Monday as he's questionable at the moment. Marcus, this comes from Corey, who, Rank, actually this one's from you. Help Corey choose between Cole Kmet and, again, Austin Hooper.
Again, as you mentioned, Austin Hooper on the injury report, but that notwithstanding, I'm going to go with Cole Kmet in this situation. Ever since Bill Lazor took over the play calling duties for the Chicago Bears, they've really featured Cole Kmet, a player they liked an awful lot coming out of Notre Dame. He was a 2nd-round draft pick this year, and we've seen the targets. He was targeted 7 times last week against the Lions, and the good news is this week, they have the Houston Texans, who've allowed the 6th most receiving yards per game to tight ends this season. I expect to see a lot of Cole Kmet this week.
All right, Marcus, this one is for you. This one comes from Weirdo TTV. Shout out to you, man. Gesicki or Ingram? What are we going to do?
I'm going to go with Evan Ingram in this case. It just seems that he's had a safer floor. He's had a more consistent target share week to week. Florio mentioned Gesicki going out and having that big game against the Bengals last week, but those have been few and far between, and I just don't trust him on a week-to-week basis. Evan Ingram, he's had some drops. I know he's had some fumbles, but on a regular basis, he's seen a good number of targets, and I think that continues this week.